The Church of the Holy Atonement had stood on a hill for more than a century, overlooking the dusty streets of suburban Austin. Its white walls, stained glass windows, and cracked roof tiles held the stories of generations of local residents. The sun was beating down mercilessly on this Sunday morning, but parishioners still pulled up for the service, parking their pickup trucks and older sedans on the gravel lot in front of the church. The Reverend Thornton Riley stood at the entrance, greeting each person who entered. His tall figure in his strict black suit radiated calm and dignity. His graying whiskers only added to his solidity, and wisdom shone in his deep-set brown eyes. In his 15 years in this church, he knew the history of every family, every parishioner. "Have a blessed Sunday, Mrs. Peterson." His low voice sounded soft as he helped an elderly parishioner up the steps. "Glad to see your leg is better." Inside the church, there was a pleasant semi-darkness. Sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows painted the wooden pews with multicolored stains. It smelled of incense and old wood. At that moment, the first sounds of the organ came from the choirs. The regent was beginning to rehearse with the choir before the service, and then he heard her voice for the first time. Riley raised his eyes to the choirs. Among the familiar faces of the choristers, he noticed a new one, a young girl with a lock of red hair gathered in a careless bun. Her voice, clear and ringing, soared above the others like a bird over a field. She sang with her eyes closed, completely immersed in the music. "That's Cordelia Mackenzie's daughter," Mrs. Peterson whispered, noticing his gaze. "Ruby. They recently moved to us from Houston." Riley nodded but didn't say anything back. Something about that voice made him freeze in place. Maybe the purity and sincerity he'd so rarely seen in recent years. The service began at 10 sharp. Reverend Riley stepped up to the pulpit, looking around at the crowd. His sermon today was about temptation and the perseverance of faith. His voice filled the space of the church, echoing off the walls and vaulted ceiling. "Temptation comes to us in many different guises," he said, feeling each word resonate in the hearts of the congregation. "It can be obvious, like the serpent in the Garden of Eden, or it can hide under a mask of goodness and beauty. But our faith is a compass that will always point the right way." During the sermon, his gaze involuntarily returned to the choirs several times. Ruby listened attentively, leaning forward as if absorbing every word. A ray of sunlight fell on her face, encircling her head like a halo. After the service, as the congregation began to disperse, Riley saw Ruby coming down from the choir. She was dressed simply, in a light-colored, knee-length summer dress and worn cowboy boots. In her hands, she held a tattered hymn book. "Reverend Riley," she approached him, slightly embarrassed. "My mom said I should introduce myself. We recently moved." "I've heard you sing," he interrupted her softly. "You have an amazing voice, child. A true gift." Ruby blushed, her freckles even more prominent. "Thank you. I sang in the choir at our old church. I hope I can do the same here." "Of course," Riley smiled. "The regent will be happy to have such a soloist. You come to rehearsals on Thursday nights." A middle-aged woman approached them, Cordelia Mackenzie, Ruby's mother. She bore a resemblance to her daughter, the same red hair, only her mother's was shorter and neatly styled. "Reverend, thank you for the beautiful sermon," she said, putting a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Come on, Ruby, we have to go." Riley watched them follow as they walked to an older Ford in the parking lot. Ruby turned around and waved at him before getting into the car. He stood on the steps of the church until the last of the congregation had departed. The heat was becoming unbearable, but he hardly noticed it. In his ears, he could still hear the clear young voice singing the old hymn. Something new had appeared in his measured life, something he could not yet put a name to. Turning, he walked back into the cool darkness of the church. He had to get ready for the evening service. But that voice, that image, they stayed with him, like the echo of a bell ringing. It was a sweltering Thursday. Ruby was late for rehearsal because she had to help her mother with the shopping after school. She ran up the church steps, clutching the music folder to her chest, her red hair disheveled from running. The church was cool. From the choir room came the sounds of the organ and disorderly singing. The warm-up had already begun. Ruby tiptoed up the spiral staircase and slipped inside. Miss Mackenzie." The regent, Mr. Peabody, a gray-haired old man with a kindly wrinkled face, nodded affably. "Join the sopranos. We were just beginning to chant." There were 15 people in the choir, mostly elderly parishioners and a few teenagers. Ruby stood next to Lisa Thompson, the only peer in the choir. Lisa motioned affably, making room. "Learning a new hymn for Easter today?" she whispered. "Quite challenging." Mr. Peabody handed out the sheet music. While the choir was learning the parts, Ruby noticed Reverend Riley in the doorway. He often stopped by rehearsals, saying he liked to listen to music. Today he wasn't in his usual suit, but a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. After an hour of rehearsal, there was a break. The choristers scattered around the church, some went outside for some air. Ruby stayed behind, poring over the notes. She wanted to finish a difficult spot in her part. "You're doing great," Riley's deep voice made her wince. He had approached unheard and now stood leaning against the back of the bench, especially the top notes. "Thank you, Reverend." Ruby felt the color flood her cheeks. "I just really love to sing. When I sing, I feel closer to God." "I see." He sat down next to her. "Music is a special language of prayer. You know, when I hear your voice, I think of the lines in the Psalter about angels singing." They talked about music, about faith, about how Ruby and her mother had moved to town after her parents divorced. Riley proved to be an attentive listener. At one point, Ruby caught herself thinking that she'd never before met someone who understood her feelings so deeply. "My mom doesn't approve of my dream of becoming a singer," she confessed. "Says I should think of something more practical, a nurse, like her." "Sometimes well-meaning parents try to protect us from disappointment," Riley said softly. "But if you have a gift, you have to develop it." At that moment, Cordelia Mackenzie appeared in the doorway. She had come to pick up her daughter after rehearsal. "Ruby, it's time to go home." There was a strained note in her voice. "Reverend Riley, good evening." "Mom, we were just talking about music," Ruby said hastily, standing up. "Of course, dear," Cordelia smiled strainedly. "But we should get going. We have to get up early tomorrow." On the way home, her mother was silent. Only just before the house did she say, "Ruby, I know that Reverend Riley is a very charismatic man, but don't forget, he's your pastor, not your friend." "Mom, you've got it all wrong," Ruby began, but Cordelia was already getting out of the car. That night, Ruby couldn't sleep for a long time. Riley's face was in front of her eyes as he talked about music, animated, eyes burning. She felt she had found a soulmate, someone who understood her better than anyone. But her mother's warning worried her. What exactly did Cordelia mean by it? Outside the window, the Texas night wind rustled, swaying the branches of the old oak tree. Ruby turned on her side and closed her eyes, trying to sleep. But her thoughts kept returning to the conversation she'd had at church today, to the way Riley had listened to her, the way he'd nodded understandingly. She didn't realize at that moment that her admiration was slowly growing into something bigger and more dangerous. The first letter appeared in Ruby's music folder after the Sunday service. A quadruple folded sheet of paper written in neat handwriting. "Your voice sounded especially heartfelt today. I wanted to share a story with you." There was no signature, but Ruby recognized Riley's handwriting immediately. She'd seen his notes on church announcements. In the letter, he talked about his journey to faith, how music had brought him to church. He wrote about his loneliness among people, about how hard it was to always be strong for others, never showing his own doubts and weaknesses. Ruby reread the letter over and over again until she had memorized every word. She responded by enclosing the note in the hymn book in his pulpit. Thus began their secret correspondence. They wrote to each other about music, about books, about their dreams and fears. With each letter, the revelations grew deeper. Thornton Riley sat in his office late at night, rereading Ruby's latest letter. "Sometimes I feel like no one but you truly understands me." His fingers trembled slightly as he folded the sheet. What is he doing? These letters, these conversations, it's all going too far. He has to stop it now. But every time he saw her in church, noticed the way she furtively sought his gaze, the way her cheeks flushed when their eyes met, he knew he couldn't break the connection. For the first time in years, he felt alive. The church library smelled of old books and dust. Ruby often came here after school, ostensibly to prepare lessons. In reality, she was waiting for him. Riley usually showed up under the pretense of working on sermons. "I found that book I was talking about," he said one day, holding out an old volume of poetry to her. Their fingers touched, and both stood still for a moment. "Read me something," Ruby asked. Her voice trembled. Riley read, and she listened, oblivious to everything in the world. At that moment, Mrs. Peabody, the regent's wife, came into the library. They barely had time to move away from each other. Cordelia had noticed a change in her daughter. Ruby had become absent-minded, often sitting staring at one point with a dreamy smile. She spent more and more time in church, finding any excuse to linger there. "Honey, maybe you should socialize more with your peers," Cordelia suggested cautiously over dinner. "Lisa Thompson said they're having a party at school." "I'm not interested in silly school parties," Ruby retorted. "And anyway, you're the one who always said church should be the centerpiece of my life." Cordelia looked at her daughter with growing concern. Something was happening. Something wrong. She noticed the way Reverend Riley's eyes changed as he looked at Ruby, how her daughter transformed in his presence. And Ruby was sinking deeper and deeper into the maelstrom of this relationship. Every letter, every secret glance, every casual touch became the center of her world. She could no longer imagine her life without this secret companionship. In her room at night, she wrote him long letters that she never dared to give him. She wrote about how much she waited for each meeting, how her heart sank when she heard his voice, about how she'd do anything to be near him. Riley was changing too. His sermons became more and more passionate, and more of them were about forbidden love and redemption. At night, he paced his office for hours, fighting the temptation to call her, to hear her voice. One night, when they met again in the library, Riley finally decided to say what he should have said long ago. "Ruby, what's going on between us? It has to stop. I can't—" But she interrupted him, placing her palm on his arm. "Please don't. I know you feel the same way. I see it in every look you give me, in every word you say." At that moment, a door slammed somewhere in the church. They recoiled from each other like burned men. Ruby hurriedly gathered her things and ran out of the library. Riley was left alone. He stared at his hands, still feeling the warmth of her touch. "God," he whispered, "give me the strength to stop this madness." But it was too late. They both knew it. Their relationship had become a maze from which there was no easy way out. And with each day, with each new letter, with each secret glance, that maze grew more and more confusing. In her diary, Ruby wrote, "I know it's a sin. I know it is wrong. But can it be a sin to do what makes me so happy? Can it be wrong what seems so natural, so right?" The April thunderstorm hit Austin unexpectedly. Ruby had stayed late at church as she and the choir prepared for the Easter service. By the time rehearsal was over, it was dark outside, and the rain had turned into a torrential downpour. "I can give you a ride," Riley offered, looking out the window at the torrents of water. The other choristers had already dispersed, hurrying to get away from the weather. Ruby knew she should refuse, but instead she nodded. The car smelled of leather and Riley's cologne. The rain drummed on the roof, creating the illusion of privacy, cutting them off from the rest of the world. They drove in silence. Riley drove slowly, too slowly, as if delaying the moment of parting. "You can stop here," Ruby said quietly as they pulled up a block from her house. "I don't want Mom to see your car." Riley parked under a large oak tree. The engine went silent. Only the sound of the rain and their breathing broke the silence. "Ruby," he began, turning to her. "Don't," she shook her head. "Please don't say anything." Their hands met on the leather upholstery of the seat. The touch burned both of them. Ruby jerked her hand away first, as if waking from an obsession. "I have to go." She grabbed her bag and sprinted out into the rain without looking back. At home, Cordelia was waiting for her in the kitchen. Ruby's open diary lay in front of her. "How could you?" Ruby shrieked when she saw her diary. "It's private." "Personal?" Cordelia stood up. "You're my daughter. I have a right to know what's going on in your life, especially when you've been acting so strange lately. You had no right to read my diary." Tears streamed down Ruby's cheeks. "You don't understand anything." "Oh, I understand everything perfectly." Cordelia's voice shook with anger and fear. "You fell in love with a man who is old enough to be your father. A priest! Do you realize how wrong that is? He understands me like no one else. Ruby clenched her fists. He sees me as a person, not the child you think I am. He's manipulating you. Cordelia took a step toward her daughter. Honey, understand. A relationship like this, they can't end well. You're just jealous, Ruby blurted out. Because after you divorced Daddy, you never got to build a normal relationship. The slap sounded like a gunshot. Both froze, shocked. Cordelia had never raised a hand to her daughter before. Ruby, I'm sorry, Cordelia began, but Ruby was already running up the stairs. The door of her room slammed. That night was the first time Ruby seriously thought about what was happening. She lay awake, listening to the thunderstorm subside. What are they doing? Where is all this going? She imagined the reaction of the congregation if the truth came out, imagined how it would ruin Riley's life, his reputation, and back at his house across town, Riley was awake. He was sitting in his office, looking at a picture of his family, his wife and 2 daughters, killed in a car accident 5 years ago. What would they think of him now? He pulled out a bottle of whiskey, an old habit he seemed to have gotten rid of long ago. His hands shook as he poured himself a glass. He was losing control. Over the situation, over himself, over feelings that should never have come up. In the morning, Ruby found a note in her school locker. We need to talk, today after school in the library. Riley's handwriting she would recognize among 1,000 others. All day she couldn't concentrate in class. Something had changed. She could feel it with every cell in her body. Their relationship had reached that dangerous point where there was no turning back. Easter week was unusually cold for Texas. A dry wind blew fallen leaves across the churchyard, and leaden clouds covered the sky. Ruby arrived early for the evening service. After a week of avoiding seeing Riley, she finally decided to talk. No one was in the church yet. Only the old gardener, Mr. Jackson, was sweeping the garden paths. He nodded to Ruby as she passed by. He would later recall this moment when telling the detectives about Ruby Mackenzie's last evening. Riley found her in the choir room. She was sitting at the piano, absent-mindedly thumbing the keys. Did you get my message? Ruby asked without turning around. Yes. He stopped in the doorway. Ruby, I know you're upset, but we have to be sensible. Prudent? She turned sharply. You've been avoiding me for a week, not answering messages. After all that has happened between us, nothing has happened. His voice sounded hard. We just let our friendship go too far. That's my fault. I should have stopped it sooner. Friendship? Ruby stood up, her eyes glistening with tears. You call this friendship? All those letters, the talking, the touching? Shh! Riley looked back nervously at the door. Someone might hear. Let them hear. Her voice shook with anger. Maybe it's time everyone knew the truth about Reverend Riley, about how he seduced a 17-year-old girl. Ruby, calm down. He stepped toward her. Let's go out into the garden. We'll talk there. The church garden was quiet. Only the lanterns cast a dim light on the gravel paths. They walked in silence until they were at an old arbor, covered with wild grapes. I love you, Ruby said quietly. And I know you love me too. Why deny it? You don't understand the consequences, Riley ran a hand over his face. If anyone finds out... Mom already knows, Ruby interrupted him. She found my journal, and if you keep ignoring me, I'm going to tell everything. To the church board, to the congregation, to everyone. Riley turned pale. You won't do that. I will. There was determination in her voice. I have nothing to lose, but you... A gust of wind swayed the branches of the trees. Thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance. A thunderstorm was beginning. Let's meet tomorrow, Riley suggested after a long silence. When we've both calmed down, we can discuss things calmly. No, Ruby shook her head. It's all going to be decided tonight. I can't live a lie anymore. She turned to leave. Riley grabbed her arm. Wait! The first drops of rain fell on the gravel of the walkway. Somewhere in the church, a bell rang, calling for the evening service. Mr. Jackson, finishing his work in the garden, saw their silhouettes by the gazebo. He would later tell detectives that he heard loud voices but could not make out the words because of the beginning of the storm. It would be the last statement about Ruby Mackenzie. The next morning, the churchyard was filled with police sirens. Detective Octavia Blackwood, a tall woman in a strict suit, stepped out of her car, surveying the scene. Her partner, Finn O'Malley, was already interviewing Mr. Jackson, who had found the body. "Victim is Ruby Mackenzie, 17 years old," the young officer reported. "A pupil at the local school, sang in the church choir. Body discovered by the gardener about 6 this morning." Blackwood put on her gloves and crouched beside the body. Ruby was lying on her back, her red hair strewn across the dew-wet grass. Strangulation marks were visible on her neck. "Where's Reverend Riley?" she asked, straightening up. "In his study," O'Malley answered. "Says he went straight home after the evening service. Wife can confirm his alibi." "Check the cameras on the neighboring houses," Blackwood ordered, "and find me the girl's mother." She took another look around the crime scene. Something about this picture made her uneasy. The murder didn't seem random, it was personal. The detectives didn't know yet that this case would be one of the most difficult of their careers. They didn't know about the letters hidden in the church library, the diary Cordelia Mackenzie burned in the fireplace last night, the secrets that the walls of the old church held. The investigation was just beginning. Octavia Blackwood had spent 15 years on the force, but this case had touched a nerve with her from the first minutes. Maybe it was the age of the victim, or the location of the crime. The murder outside the church walls seemed particularly sacrilegious. "Time of death is between 9 and 11 p.m. The medical examiner finished the initial examination. "The cause is strangulation. There are signs of a struggle, and skin particles were found under the victim's fingernails. She may have been trying to defend herself." O'Malley recorded Mr. Jackson's statement. "I saw her yesterday before the service. She was talking to Reverend Riley by the gazebo. The storm was starting. There was thunder rumbling. I didn't hear what they were talking about." "What time was that?" Blackwood clarified. "About 8 o'clock. The service started at 8:30. The detectives glanced around. The first discrepancy, Riley claimed he'd been busy all evening preparing for the service and hadn't met with Ruby. The church council met in full force. Older ladies blotted their eyes with handkerchiefs. Men frowned. Mrs. Peabody, the regent's wife, appeared especially talkative. Ruby was a talented girl, beautiful voice, but lately she's changed. She's become withdrawn, irritable, and those long hours in the library. In the library? Blackwood was wary. Yes, she often stayed after rehearsals. Said she was preparing lessons. Reverend Riley often worked there too. O'Malley headed for the library. The small room was filled with old bookcases. On the table were unfolded sheet music, hymn books. He methodically looked through every book, every shelf. At Cordelia Mackenzie's house, there was a heavy odor of valerian. The woman looked haggard, dark circles under her eyes. "Mrs. Mackenzie," Blackwood began softly, "I need to ask you some questions. Have you noticed anything unusual in your daughter's behavior lately?" Cordelia was silent for a long moment, then said quietly, "She's been distant from me, spent all her time at church. I thought that was a good thing. I thought faith would help her get through our divorce from her father." "When was the last time you saw her?" "Yesterday morning. We had a fight. She didn't come home for the night, but I thought she was at a friend's." Cordelia burst into tears. Back at the station, Blackwood was reviewing the surveillance footage. One camera from a neighboring house partially captured the church garden. In the mist and rain, 2 figures could be seen by the gazebo. Then a flash of lightning, and one figure was left lying motionless on the ground. "Chief," O'Malley placed a shabby envelope on the table. "Found this in the library, between the pages of a Bible." The letter was written in Riley's familiar handwriting. "Ruby, what's going on between us has to stop. I can't risk everything I have." "Check his alibi," Blackwood ordered, "and find me every camera within a mile radius of the church. Something tells me Reverend Riley knows more than he's letting on." That evening, the detectives questioned Riley again. He sat in his office, outwardly calm, but the fingers clutching the cross on his chest gave away his tension. "Reverend," Blackwood placed the found letter in front of him, "you said you haven't had any private conversations with Ruby. How do you explain that?" I mentored her spiritually." His voice trembled. "She was a troubled teenager looking for support." "And that's why you met with her secretly in the library?" Riley turned pale. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." Blackwood stepped forward, "and I advise you to be honest, for your own good." At that moment, a panting O'Malley ran into the office. "Chief, you need to see this. We found her cell phone." The day was over, but the investigation was only gaining momentum. Blackwood felt they were on the right track. The key now was not to spook their prey early. The tech lab at the Austin police station was cool. A digital forensics expert was leaning over Ruby's phone, recovering deleted messages. Most of the correspondence was done through an app with automatic message deletion, he explained to the detectives. But some were recovered. The last message was sent at 8:15 p.m. "I'll tell you everything. You leave me no choice." Blackwood jotted down the time in her notebook. Who was it addressed to? The number is registered to a prepaid phone, but look at the nature of the correspondence over the last 3 months. Fragments of messages appeared on the screen. "You're the only one who understands me. I can't stop thinking about our conversations. Why are you avoiding me?" O'Malley, meanwhile, was interviewing students at Austin High School. Lisa Thompson, Ruby's best friend, was nervously rubbing the sleeve of her school jacket. "She's changed since Christmas. She got kind of distant, always checking her phone, rushing to church. I thought maybe she was in love with someone." "Did she talk about anyone in particular?" "No, but—" Lisa hesitated. "I saw her hide letters in a textbook once. The handwriting was male, but she wouldn't say who they were from." In the archives, Blackwood researched Riley's past. 5 years ago, a tragic accident claimed the lives of his wife and daughters. After that, he'd moved to Austin. But there was something else. "Found it!" she exclaimed, pulling out an old newspaper clipping. "Houston, the year 2019. A 17-year-old parishioner of the church where Riley served committed suicide. The suicide note mentioned an inappropriate relationship with a spiritual advisor. The case was dismissed for lack of evidence." O'Malley whistled. "That sounds too much like a coincidence." At Riley's house, detectives discovered a carefully hidden box. Inside were photos of the dead family and a diary. "I must be strong for the flock," Blackwood read, "but sometimes the loneliness becomes unbearable. Ruby reminds me of my Sarah. The same innocence, the same purity. God forgive me for thinking that." In the evening, the detectives were drawing up a crime scheme. "Look," Blackwood arranged markers on the timeline. "Riley lost his family, moved to Austin to escape the scandal in Houston, met Ruby, who reminded him of his daughter. First spiritual counseling, then letters, secret meetings. When things got out of hand, she threatened to reveal their relationship." O'Malley picked up on that. For him, it would have meant the end of everything: his reputation, his career, his new life. But there's something else. Blackwood pulled out the forensic results. It wasn't just skin particles found under Ruby's fingernails. There were fibers of cloth black wool, like a priest's costume. At that moment, there was a knock on the office. "Detective Blackwood, there's a call for you from Cordelia Mackenzie. She says it's urgent." The theory was beginning to take shape, but something told Blackwood the worst discoveries were yet to come. Ruby's diary was found by children playing in an abandoned barn behind the church. The leather notebook with worn pages was hidden beneath the rotten floorboards. Cordelia recognized her daughter's handwriting, but denied having seen the notebook before. "That's not the diary I read," she told the detectives. "That one had a blue cover. This is the first time I've seen this one." Blackwood spent a sleepless night reading Ruby's entries. The last one was dated April 20th, 3 days before the murder. "I can't pretend anymore," Ruby wrote. "He says everything must remain secret, that people won't understand. But can love be a sin? Yesterday he said we must stop seeing each other, that his wife suspects something." His wife? He never told me he was married again? O'Malley was in the process of analyzing the security footage. In addition to the one that captured the moment of the murder, there were 3 other cameras nearby. At 8:15, Ruby sends her last message. He arranged the footage in chronological order. At 8:20, she enters the church garden. At 8:30, the service begins, but neither Ruby nor Riley is at it. And what do the cameras show at 9? Blackwood walked over to the screen. At 9:32, a figure in dark clothing walks briskly from the church to the parking lot. You can't make out his face because of the rain and darkness, but his gait is distinctive, limping on his right leg. Like Riley, after an old knee injury, Blackwood said thoughtfully. Forensics had provided new evidence. In the folds of Ruby's clothes, they'd found traces of soil with a high lime content, the kind of soil only found in one place in the church garden, by the old gazebo. It all fits. O'Malley drew a diagram in his notebook. They meet at the gazebo. Ruby threatens to expose their relationship. A struggle ensues. Hold on, Blackwood interrupted him. The lab called. Remember the black wool fibers under the victim's fingernails? They don't match Riley's suit. Meaning? Riley was wearing a synthetic suit that night, and the fibers are from an expensive wool fabric. Detectives requested camera footage from every clothing store within a 50-mile radius. The footage, dated April 2nd, showed a man who looked like Riley shopping for a black wool suit at a men's clothing boutique. He was getting ready. Blackwood tapped her pen on the table. Bought a suit that could then be destroyed. That's not a crime of passion. He was planning a murder. A search warrant for Riley's house was obtained by late afternoon. The detectives waited until nightfall. Blackwood was rereading the witness statements when her eye caught on one detail. "O'Malley," she called to her partner. "Remember what Mrs. Peabody said about Ruby's habits in the library? Now look at this diary entry dated March 15th. O'Malley read it and whistled. What a twist. "Call the extraction team." Blackwood rose from the table. "Time to wrap this story up." Clouds were gathering again in the Austin night. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, a reminder of that fateful night. Blackwood buckled her flak jacket and checked her weapon. She knew that tonight all the secrets of Holy Redemption Church would finally be revealed. The Austin Police Department interrogation room seemed especially cramped that evening. The Reverend Thornton Riley sat at the table with his hands folded in front of him. His black shirt with the priest's collar was wrinkled, and deep shadows lingered under his eyes. Blackwood laid the surveillance photos, pages from Ruby's diary, printouts of messages in front of him. "Let's be honest, Reverend." She sat down across from him. "We know about the suit you bought specifically for this. We know about the incident in Houston, about your new marriage, the one you've been keeping from Ruby." Riley was silent, looking at his hands. "She threatened to tell everything," Blackwood continued. "Not just about your relationship. She found out something else, didn't she? Something about that girl from Houston?" "You don't understand," his voice sounded hoarse. "I've been trying to make things right, tried to stop this madness." "Tell us your side of the story," O'Malley offered, taking a seat next to his partner. Riley raised his eyes. Tears stood in them. "After my family died, I was broken. In Houston, that girl, Emily, she reminded me of my oldest daughter. I let myself get attached to her. When she realized our relationship had gone too far, she couldn't take it. Her death was on my conscience. And Ruby? I thought things would be different here. New town, new life. I remarried, tried to start over, and then she showed up, so young, so pure. I knew it was a sin, but I couldn't stop." "What happened that night?" Riley ran a hand over his face. "She found old newspaper clippings about Emily's death, threatened to tell me not only about us, but about that incident. I tried to explain. She screamed, she cried, and then, I don't even remember how my hands got around her neck. She looked at me like that with such horror." Behind the glass of the interrogation room, other officers gathered. Cordelia Mackenzie, called in to identify some of the evidence, was crying silently, covering her face with her hands. "I didn't mean to kill her." Riley lowered his head. "Just wanted her to be quiet, so no one would find out." "You bought the suit ahead of time," Blackwood reminded him stiffly. "Picked a place with no cameras. It was a planned assassination. I thought I could change her mind. The suit was a backup. I prayed I wouldn't have to." At Holy Redemption Church, an emergency council was meeting at the time. When news of Riley's arrest reached the congregation, many refused to believe it, but the evidence was irrefutable. "Thornton Riley," O'Malley rose, reading the indictment. "You are under arrest for the first-degree murder of Ruby Mackenzie." As he was led out of the station, reporters had already gathered outside the entrance. Camera flashes illuminated his downcast face. Somewhere in the crowd there were shouts of curses. Blackwood watched the police car take Riley away. 15 years on the force, but cases like this still took the edge off. The man people trusted with their souls turned out to be a monster in the mask of a righteous man. "You know," she told O'Malley, "the worst part is that he really believed he loved those girls. To the very end, he thought he was a victim of circumstance." In Riley's pocket, they found a crumpled photograph of Ruby from the last service. On the back in his handwriting was written, "Forgive me, Lord, for I have sinned." Thornton Riley's trial lasted 3 weeks. The hall was packed with parishioners, journalists, the curious. Cordelia Mackenzie sat in the front row, motionless, her face petrified. The prosecutor had presented irrefutable evidence. Ruby's diary, surveillance footage, signs of a struggle, witness statements. The defense was built on temporary mental confusion, but the jury was unimpressed. "Defendant," the judge's voice boomed through the hushed hall. "Rise for the reading of the verdict." Riley rose. In his prison robe, he seemed smaller, older. Gone was his former preacher's charisma. "For the first-degree premeditated murder of Ruby Mackenzie, the court sentences you to life in prison without parole." Holy redemption. Church had emptied out. Many parishioners could not bring themselves to cross the threshold of the church where the tragedy occurred. The gazebo in the garden was torn down. In its place, they planted a rose bush, Ruby's favorite flowers. Cordelia sold the house and moved to another city. Before she left, she went to the station to say goodbye to the detectives. "I should have noticed sooner," she told Blackwood. "Should have protected my little girl." "It's not your fault," Blackwood replied softly. He was deceiving everyone. A month later, Blackwood and O'Malley stood at Ruby's grave. Fresh flowers covered the marble headstone. Among them were notes from classmates, photographs, music sheets. "You know what the scariest thing about this case is?" Blackwood said thoughtfully. "Not the fact of the murder itself. It's how easily evil can hide under the mask of good. How a man to whom people trusted their most intimate confidences could live a double life. And yet truly believe he was right," O'Malley added. "Until the last moment, he believed he was acting out of love." It was getting evening. The rays of the setting sun were coloring the sky pink. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled, but no longer at the Church of the Holy Redemption. "The case is closed." Blackwood placed a white rose on the grave. "But some questions will remain unanswered. For example, did that girl from Houston really kill herself? Maybe some mysteries should remain mysteries." O'Malley headed for the car. Blackwood lingered at the grave. The tombstone was inscribed with a line from Ruby's favorite hymn, "And I will sing your glory forever and ever." The detective looked back at the grave one last time and walked to her car. There was a new case ahead, new mysteries. But the story of Ruby Mackenzie and Reverend Riley was forever etched in her mind as a reminder that the worst evil often wears the mask of holiness.